It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Scott Taylor. He's a senior red team operator with Rowe Price. Formerly, he was at MITRE as a lead for the Caldera project. Caldera is an automated adversary emulation platform. And he's going to give us some insight into his experiences transitioning the team at Rowe Price to adversary emulation and purple teaming. So please help me welcome Scott to the stage.
All right, can everyone hear me? Good, good, good. Fantastic. All right. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for making it out today. Of course, again. Yeah, so as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about all kinds of, attacking and incorporating into red teaming, basically Bryson's attackity-tackity-tack talk. So let's get on into it. All right, so talk today, attacking offensive operations. So a little bit about myself. As mentioned, I'm a senior red team operator at Rowe Price. Prior to that, I was with MITRE doing some automated adversary emulation with Caldera. To kick off my career, I was a Linux system administrator at enterprise version 7. And I do have a couple of certifications, no SAN certs, got to get on the bandwagon there, but I've done a bit of schooling. And if you do want to reach out to me ever, it's Scott C. Taylor 12 across the board, whether it's GitHub, Twitter, LinkedIn, go ahead. Right, so throughout the talk today, we're going to talk about some of the pitfalls that I've seen in enterprise red teams, some solutions that I'm recommending. Of course, talk about some terminology that I'll be using throughout the talk, and then, of course, talk about how to take actions and put them into a plan. So let's get on into it. So throughout my red team experience, I've seen a couple of things that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Right, I've seen organizations that do this whole monthly red team operations. It's a pretty aggressive schedule to do one every single month. But then, of course, you zoom in, you find out, well, they're kind of just unannounced penetration tests. Along that same line, focused on number of findings, right, as a metric. And, that's very pen testy. It's very, ranging from criticals to lows to informational, right? Is that really what red teaming is supposed to be about? And then you find out, well, how did you go about running your red team exercise? What did you execute? We kind of wung it. We use those cool tools from GitHub. Well, that's not, incorporating very much threat intelligence into your red team operations. And at the end of the day, some of these ideas all put together, they don't really prepare your blue teams for real threat actors. Right, so give us some time, give them some thought. I thought about, how should we structure, these ideas? So Joe Vest, tech director of CobbleStrike, I heard him talking about this idea where, let's break it up. Do it attack surface reduction and threat emulation. So attack surface reduction, you can think of that as your traditional penetration testing, right? Let's see how many findings we can find. What vulnerabilities do exist, right? And that's completely valid. We don't want to forget that kind of stuff. But if we're going to talk about real, threat emulation, that's a whole different, side of the house. It requires different skills. It requires different ideas. So with that, especially as numerous people have talked about, there's this idea of purple teaming, there's red teaming, really trying to understand what threats are going after your organization and how we can adequately prepare. All right. So there's a lot of ideas involved in this. So just to level set here, I'll go over some terminology. Just as a disclaimer, right? I'm not trying to say these are the de facto definitions, right? That's always a little bit of a challenge in the industry. But these are just some of the terms that I'm going to be going off of. Right. So offensive operations, right? What's that? I really liked how Sans here structured that idea of offensive operations. It's kind of an umbrella term. There's all kinds of different operations involved. So in this case, you might be talking about penetration testing, red teaming, vulnerability assessments, right? I personally am on a red team, but I do more than just that, right? I do some penetration testing, right? So it's, just for this general concept, right? Offensive operations, more of an umbrella term. For today, I'm primarily going to be focused on red teaming and purple teaming, right? So getting into that, this is more of our threat emulation side of the house. So with purple teaming, taken straight from Site's Purple Team exercise framework, right? These are open exercises, lots of collaboration, lots of discussion between your red and your blue teams, right? Particularly when I do them, especially in the age of COVID, right? I share my screen, and if I'm using Cobalt Strike, for example, or whatever tools I'm using, I will just share my screen and say, hello, blue team, this is what I'm doing, right? I want to help the blue team, develop strong detections. We focus on attack techniques. We'll talk about that, of course, in a second. And ideally, we want to focus on improving those people, processes, and technologies. On the red teaming side of the house, this is when we kind of put up the wall a little bit, but we are focused on emulating real world threats, right? We don't want to just, try to be ultra covert. We want to actually emulate realistic tactics, techniques, and procedures. All right, so in this case, we're focused on training and measuring the actual blue team that's in place to defend against these real world threats. Of course, more terms here, right? Our pyramid of pain. I'm sure some of you guys have seen this. This was developed by David Bianco over at Target. If we look at the bottom of the pyramid here, right, we look at some things that are really trivial for attackers to get around, right? These are hash values, right? Throw another character in your tool, change a byte, changes the hash value, your detection's completely broken. We funnel our way up the tool chain. You see up there towards the top, we have our tools, right? People love talking about tools. That's where we start seeing a different malware loader every other week, right? You see that Squirrel Waffle recently. There's QBot, TrickBot. So many tools that people like to zoom in and focus on. Whereas, what I like to suggest to my teams, and I say, well, let's really focus on the behaviors. Let's focus on the TTPs. What are those malware loaders actually doing, right? Oh, they're process injecting. They're loading Cobalt Strike beacons. Great. Let's focus on that. What are these tools also doing, right? So that's where we focus on these tactics, the behaviors of what adversaries are trying to do. So, of course, tactics, techniques, and procedures, right? That in itself is kind of a buzzword, right? TTPs, right? So at a high level, we see here that a high-level tactic is a goal or objective that an adversary is trying to accomplish. In this case, I've highlighted initial access. And of course, this is zoomed in on the MITRE attack framework, right? Initial access, how does the attacker get into the environment? Zoomed in a little bit more are the techniques. Some ideas are some ways that attackers actually get in. So you can see there's like phishing or getting those ODAs on your VPN appliances. Whatever the case is, there's some of these techniques on ways they are getting in. And then lastly, there's procedures. And that's where you start looking at some of those tools, some of those specific ideas, such as like malicious macros in Office documents. Right, so that's, as I'm talking about tactics, techniques, and procedures, just remember, this is what I'm specifically referring to. Right, and then of course, every presenter's worst nightmare trying to fit the entire attack framework onto one slide, but this is my best effort here. This is what it looks like when you look at the entire spectrum. Right, lots of techniques, lots of procedures to look at. So obviously, for any organization that's interested in, starting to dig into the attack framework, it's pretty overwhelming, right? So we're going to talk about some ideas on how to, focus your organization on, how to focus specifically on the techniques that you should really be worried about. So we talked about some of these ideas. Let's see how we can put this all in action to actually help your organizations prepare for real threat actors. So what I've done is, mapped out this idea where we can leverage purple teams and leverage red teaming and put this in a nice, cyclical process on, attacking the core problems, the core threats that are faced with your organizations today. So starting out, we're talking about all this threat emulation. We're talking about threats going after your organization. We need threat intelligence. What are the threats doing that are attacking our organizations, right? If you're in the medical community, you might be looking at those hospital ransomwares that are going on. If you're in the financial industry, you might be looking at banking Trojans that are going after your organization, right? So those are, that's where we want to start. We want to get the base are coming after our organization. Then once we get an idea of what kinds of threats are out there, what are the techniques being used? Then we'll focus on developing some purple team proposals. Let's figure out, what techniques do we focus on? What techniques are being used in the wild that we should really be focusing our detection strategies on? And then we put it, we do it. We perform some purple team operations. And we take that time to really work with our blue team, the people that are defending our organization, right? We really want to focus on coming up with a good detection strategy, making sure we're adequately prepared for the threat. Now, that's awesome. We do that collaborative process. We get a good idea of where we currently are at, try to improve. But then we want to really test out in a potentially live fire situation, how do we actually fare? So that's when we start doing red team operations. We emulate threats. We put up the walls. We see, in a real scenario, how well can the blue team respond and react to the threat? And then the most important part, reporting and lessons learned. We want to talk about what went well, what didn't go well. Are there improvements that need to be made? There's all kinds of ideas that can be discussed to make a collaborative decision on how we should improve the organization. So going through these steps one by one, right? Talking about that cyber threat intelligence, right? So fortunately, I've worked at organizations where we have a dedicated threat intel team that can go out and find that juicy information for our specific organization. So, if that's not the case for you guys, right? Report, there's plenty of resources out there that you can use to collect cyber threat intelligence. Lots of the intel that I find is on Twitter, right? Trying to find, real breaches that are happening, dissecting information from that, and really, formulating it into the, attack framework. So ideally, if I'm going to try to find what intel I want, I'll reach out and say, hey, threat intelligence team, let me know what threat actor should we really be focused on? What techniques does that threat actor actually, what are some characteristics? And then, right, we have a discussion between the red team and the cyber threat intelligence team. We talk about, we have this open collaboration. What do we really need to be focused on right now? So as an example, right, for each of these steps, I'm trying to outline the objectives and then just give it a little fictional example. So in this case, we're focused on the crazy bear, right? This random ransomware actor is trying to, get that cryptocurrency, deploy ransomware in your organization. Right, as Bryson pointed out, it's a pretty real threat. Businesses are very focused on the implication that it has on the business. Right, and then the threat intel team is like, what? When we've seen this threat actor in the wild, we've noticed that they use scheduled tasks for persistence, and then they also like to dump credentials out of LSAS to steal credentials. Right, so those are some, pretty heavy attack techniques. There's a lot of threat actors out there that use these basic techniques in order to accomplish their objectives. All right, so as a red team, I'll talk to my fellow red team members, and I'll say, what? Let's figure out a way that we can test for these techniques. Right, so we look over that threat profile, we figure out what techniques they're using, and ideally, we come up with a list of procedures for each technique. Right, so as I mentioned earlier, our techniques are those high-level techniques that are being used to accomplish a tactic. However, a procedure, that's when we start talking about tools. So if we're going to develop a detection for a technique, we're going to have to come up with numerous variations of procedures to make sure that we're catching all of our procedures. So in this case, for the example, I've talked about the LSAS memory credential dumping technique. Now, in this case, you might recognize some of these tools, right? Classic Mimikatz, right? That's been going on for over a decade at this point. And if I'm a red teamer wanting to work on this with my blue team, I'll come up with a couple of ideas on how to simulate that activity. So I might just pull Mimikatz right off of GitHub, right? Just use that in my purple team exercise, see what kind of detections, what kind of alerts we have for that, right? Adding a little bit more sophistication, right? Looking at that PowerShell, right? There's invoke Mimikatz, so we can use to try to live off the land, right? If we want to add even more sophistication, we can use a C# version of Sharpcats, right? And that's that's kind of where the newest tradecraft is focused on, using Cobalt Strike's execute assembly, operating in memory, process injecting, fork and run, if you've heard of those terms, right? So that's where, maybe your more sophisticated adversaries might be focused on. And then if you really want to get fancy, you can focus on those BOFs in CobbleStrike's latest versions, right? Your beacon object files, using direct syscalls to dump, the LSAS process. Right, so there's all these different ideas, different ways that you can dump credentials. And what I like to focus on with my security teams is I say, you know what, let's, don't focus on these tools. I don't want IOCs for these tools. I want to focus on detecting the technique, the behavior. What is the attacker actually trying to accomplish? Oh, and then of course, my last one, using sysinternals, right? There are living off the land tools, such as, sysinternals proc dump. There's also, there's numerous examples here, but just to give you the idea, right? We want to focus on not just a specific tool, but the entire technique in total. All right, so I, write up this proposal. I say, hey, blue team, this is what our cyber threat intelligence team is recommending that we focus on. Let's pick a time and date to sit down, work on this together. I'll run my procedures. You can share your screen. We'll go through our EDR tools, our antivirus tools, whatever you have for your defenses. And let's see how it goes. All right, so that's where we lead to executing our purple team exercises. All right, so we already shared that proposal. We're going to run some of these tools, some of these commands. Right, and like I mentioned, I'm giving the blue team full awareness of what I am running. I'm going to share my screen, going to tell them process IDs, whatever they need to help them, hunt down this activity, telling them what machine I'm running on, right? Full awareness of what's happening. Right, and I like to tell the blue team, right? Let's strive for that one detection to rule them all, right? Let's try to come up with a way to detect the entire technique. Now, of course, some of the blue teamers are probably rolling their eyes. It's like, oh, Scott, that's not that easy. I know. Right, we're going to have to research it. We're going to have to figure out some ways. We might not have the right tooling, but the purple team exercises are going to expose those things, right? If we need to focus on specific tools, we can. If we need to, approach it from another angle, that's the time to do that. Right? We're going to dedicate individual time to sit down and really focus on these techniques. Right, and of course, even during this process, me as a red teamer, I'll help the red team or blue team build detections. As a red teamer, I should know how my tools work. Right? If that's the case, then I can certainly help the blue team build detections and prepare the organization for this specific technique. So, right, so as an example, right, let's say I'm going into my purple team exercise. I run all 5 of those tools, right? My Mimikatz, InvokeCats, SharpCats, BoffCats, whatever it is. I'm running all these different tools. And on the blue team side, they have an existing alert for it that looks for a command line parameter for Secrolsa. All right, this is, if you're familiar with that, that's a specific command line argument in Mimikatz. All right, so if I actually were to do this purple team exercise, that would result in 1 out of 5 procedures detected. Right, and that's because that procedure or that specific detection is really focused on one tool. Right, it will catch that initial Mimikatz straight off of GitHub. So if I work with my blue team on this, and I say, you know what, let's focus on the actual behavior. What is happening with all these tools? What's Mimikatz actually doing? Right, really what's going on here, we're injecting into the LSAS process and dumping the memory contents. So if you look at a tool like Sysmon, for example, Sysmon has a fantastic event ID 10 that does exactly this. It'll look for any time a process accesses the memory space of another process. Right, so and that's exactly what's going on here with all these various procedures. Right, so if I load up Sysmon on my machine and I look for event ID 10, and I look for all these different processes trying to inject into LSAS, you're going to find that all 5 of these tools come up. Now, of course, again, the blue teamers are probably rolling their eyes. Scott, there's so many processes that do this on a normal basis. Of course, right? During the purple team exercise, we're going to take the time to filter out some of those false positives. We're going to figure out, what's normal, what's not normal, right? And that's not going to be the easiest process, but this is, the steps that I'd like to take to really focus on these techniques. So, right, at a high level, right, when we're looking at this purple team program, right, cyber threat intel, going out, trying to find that intel for us. As a red team, we're going to take the intel, turn it into actionable threat emulation exercises. And then the blue team, collaboratively, we're going to develop strong detections for the technique, right? Not focus on these specific tools, but try to really focus on the high level technique, prevent this from happening regardless of what implementation there is of the technique. Right, so now this purple team process I talked about, it's very technology specific, right? I'm really focused on that. And you can do purple teams on, focused on developing your people, developing your processes, but usually I focus on the technology. So now we need a way to figure out, is my organization prepared from the aspect of my people and processes? And that's where red teaming comes in. So, I like to use the assume breach model, right? I don't want to spend 3 weeks out of my 4 weeks doing phishing. That's super frustrating and quite a waste of time. So I like to really focus on that assume breach model. I'll drop some kind of DLL, EXE, whatever my initial payload is, drop it on a system, let it rip. Maybe that's Cobalt Strike, whatever your C2 choice is, and go from there, start from the inside. Now, as we're going and carrying out our red team operation, let's really focus on the techniques that the threat actor is actually using, right? So we want to, really figure out what's the best way to prepare our blue teams by emulating the adversary itself, right? If you want to develop custom tools, sure, you can do that, but just remember the specific techniques that we really are trying to focus on during this operation. Right, and I mentioned earlier, people like to talk about this whole low to high critical vulnerability ratings, right? For red teaming, I like to focus on 2 things: time to detect, time to remediate, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what matters. That's what the blue team needs to successfully do to keep out a threat. So if we look at an example, right, some of these attack techniques you might be familiar with. And some of these techniques, specifically schedule tasks, LSAS memory, process dumping, right, credential dumping, those techniques we focused on during the purple team exercise. Blue team will be totally ready for that. And some red teamers might look at me and say, well, wait, that means you're going to get caught, right? Sure, that's great if I get caught. I'm emulating a threat. I do not care about getting caught. I want to prepare the blue team and make sure they are prepared for the threat. So, right, if I use my C2 and hide it behind AWS, cool, whatever. If I use living off the land binaries, that's great because that's what the threat actor is actually doing, right? So if I want to develop a custom red team DLL to drop on the system, great. If I, whatever languages I want to use, that's fine. But as long as I'm trying to stick to the idea of the threat profile, right, this is going to prepare your blue team for the threat when the time comes. Right, so then schedule tasks, LSAS memory, like I said, they've been adequately prepared for this. This should be the point where they are ready to detect. And then those people and processes, that's where it kicks in. They got to be ready to take that alert, action it, respond to the threat appropriately based off of the organization's incident response plan. So, let's say, from my perspective in this example, the detection, maybe it happened in 2 hours. That's great. And then, based off of their IR procedures, they're able to cut it off in about 3 hours. Right, so that would be a very successful threat emulation, a red team operation where the blue team is able to really get hands-on practice with using their detections that they developed, actioning them, and detecting and responding to the threat. Right, so as I am, performing these various assessments with my team, I'm keeping track of times, right? Because of course, if I'm gonna report on time to detect, time to respond, I got to keep track of, what does it look like for my pacing? What's my cadence, right? I'm going to keep track of when I'm actually executing these techniques. So, I have that going on. I try to automate that as best as possible. I have my times for detect and response, and then also there's this thing called the attack navigator. And I like to use that to demonstrate or show visually what techniques I'm using during my red team operation, just to give an idea of where, what techniques we've focused on already. And then as far as the blue team, right, they're going to share what worked, what processes worked in the IR plan, what needs to be improved, right? Do we have the people ready? Do we have the processes in place to actually stop these threats? And of course, we focus on those areas of improvement. So as an example, right, I'm going to share my detection and response times with them. I'm going to talk about what tools I used, what techniques I specifically focused on. The blue team, maybe they look at this and they say, well, we got to further tune up that sysmon config, right? Maybe event ID 10 needs to be tuned up a little bit. There's some false positives in there that resulted in our team kind of discarding those alerts that we created. Yeah. All right, that's fine. I mean, it's better to figure that out now than in the real event. Right, and maybe the blue team says, hey, you know what? One of those techniques you did process injection, right? Maybe specifically process hollowing, right? Let's do a purple team on that. Let's really, that's where the process becomes cyclical, right? As we introduce new techniques, we can really focus on them, do purple teams, try to get a good handle on them, and then put them in a big red team operation and see when we chain them all together, can we appropriately detect and respond to those events? Right. So in conclusion, our red team, some of the benefits that we've ran into, incorporating CTI into our operations, it's fantastic, right? We get to learn what's happening in the wild, where are adversaries actually using to accomplish their objectives, right? Additionally, we like to expand our tradecraft, especially doing these purple team exercises. I like to try to get 3 to 5 different variations of our attack technique as far as procedures, right? So sometimes I'll do my own custom tool development and really get a good handle on these techniques themselves. And of course, the best benefit of doing this is we have a great collaborative environment for our blue team, right? So it's not this whole walled off scenario where, oh, the blue team's over there, the red team's over there, we don't talk to each other, right? It's very collaborative, right? New techniques come out. As a red teamer, I'll share, some things that I'm working on. As a blue team, they'll talk about some of the cool detection ideas they have, right? They'll even suggest some purple team exercises that we do. So it makes for a great environment where everybody is focused on the threat, right? It's not this whole red versus blue. We're one security team. We're all focused on the same threat. As a blue team, right, we get the opportunity to focus and tune our tools, right? We spend so much money on security tooling. It's ridiculous that we don't take that time to really make sure the tool works for our organization, right? So out of the box, sure, maybe it does some cool stuff, but if I do my LSAS credential dumping, maybe it could be tuned up a little bit, right? Maybe there's some configuration settings that need to be adjusted. And of course, I'm sure many IR analysts are out here being like, well, Scott, I only get the opportunity to just burn through all those alerts, right? I can't focus on anything else, right? So when we take the time to do this, they get to focus on their tools. They get to really explore, have fun, focus on these techniques instead of just responding to alert after alert. The biggest thing that I've noticed is, as an organization, we can make data-backed decisions on the projects and purchases we make, right? So instead of just trying to buy the coolest tool off the shelf, we can say, you know what? We've talked about doing this whole sysmon deployment thing. Let's actually take the time to do it. We used it during a purple team exercise. That worked. My other tools didn't. Let's actually deploy sysmon at scale and make that a valid detection source for our security team. And of course, hands-on practice with incident response. You can't get enough of it, right? When the time comes, you want to be comfortable, cool, calm, and collected, ready to respond to the threat at hand. Right, so when we take the time to do these red team operations, they get that exposure, they get that practice, responding, remediating, and then doing post-incident response activities. Right, so I'm talking, I've given a lot of examples here. I've talked about this scenario where, yeah, big organizations, CTI teams, red teams, blue teams, right? But I do want to address, maybe some of the smaller teams that are out there that don't have these dedicated red teams or dedicated cyber threat intelligence team that can go and collect your information for you. So with that, here's what I recommend if you're more of a small organization. Red Canary, they have this fantastic resource called the Atomic Red Team on GitHub, right? So it takes a bunch of these attack techniques that are on this ginormous spreadsheet of the attack framework. And it does exactly what I talked about earlier, where it gives example of a bunch of procedures for each technique. So if you were to, for example, go to the Atomic Red Team, go to your, whether it's process injection, or I even talked about the LSAS credential dumping. If you go to that technique in Red Canary's Atomic Red Team, it'll give all the procedures that I talked about, plus more. There's tons of them. So it gives you ideas for how to actually test those specific techniques. Right, so obviously this week is Pen Test HackFest. Pay attention to the talks for sure, but maybe next week, give it a browse, check it out. Within a month, right? Pick an attack technique. If you want to try to go source your own threat intelligence, go ahead, right? Maybe if you're working in a hospital environment, go check out some of the DFIR reports specifically of hospitals getting attacked. Right? You can get a general idea of what these threat actors are doing for your environment. So if you don't know, if it's overwhelming, I'll give you a hint. Focus on credential dumping. Attackers are using it all the time, or specifically threat actors are using it all the time. All right, so I've dropped a link in there as well, where you can find specifically the credential dumping Atomic Red Team page. And then within a quarter, I get it, things can move a little slowly, but within the next 3 months, build a little test machine, hook it up to the network, and run some of those atomic procedures. Right, it's a good form of unit testing. Right, we can really focus on seeing what happens when we focus on a behavior instead of all 3 to 5 tools that we run for as far as these procedures. Now, of course, as a bonus, right, as I mentioned, I used to work on the Caldera project at MITRE. They have an atomic plugin where if you want to automate this kind of stuff, you can load up Caldera. It's free and open source, of course, so you can spin it up as easy as you want. So you focus on that. You build a little adversary focused on specifically those procedures, and you can test these tools very easily. Right, so if you're interested in really turning this into a full functioning program, getting some automation involved, you can do that for absolutely free using Caldera. So with that, thank you so much for attending my talk today. Whether you're here in person or watching virtually. Again, if you want to reach out to me, Scott C. Taylor 12 across the board. Reach out anytime. I'm more than happy to have a chat. So with that, thank you so much again, and go attack those offensive operations. Thank you.
That was